living organisms to give us a clue to how it all might have happened. Now, I don't know whether that's right or wrong. It's, to me, the most persuasive suggestion as to how the code might have evolved that has yet been made. It has the enormous virtue that you can get from not having a code to having a code in small steps. Even being able to attach one amino acid out of the many different possible kinds to one nucleotide and using that as a cofactor for one of your ribozymes would be an advantage. And then if one, why not two? If two, why not three kinds, and so on. You can imagine a whole series of intermediate steps between not having a code and having one. But it may not be right. Now, I've talked in some detail about one particular change in the way in which information is encoded and transmitted. But I want to spend the rest of my talk suggesting to you that, in fact, one can see evolution, the whole of evolution, as punctuated by a small number, perhaps half a dozen, major transitions, major changes in the way in which information is encoded, stored, and transmitted. And my friend Sasmari and I have recently written a big fat book about this, but it really is, I'm afraid, a book which is written for people with a fair bit of biochemistry. Ursch always insisted in putting in more chemistry than I wanted him to, but since the ideas were often his, I couldn't argue. And I want just to sort of summarize what this notion may be. The first major event, of course, was the origin of replicating molecules themselves. A problem we have not yet solved, but which seems to me to be very close to a solution. I don't think we're all that far from having a full chemical account of the origin of the first replicating molecules. The next major change in the genetic system would have been the origin of chromosomes. A chromosome is simply a string of these molecules end to end, which has the property that when you replicate one of them, you have to replicate them all. No one of them can get copied without the others. The reason why that matters is the following, that if you have lots of different genes in the cell, let's say it's form a cell and you have lots of different genes, but each gene is separate from each other one. They're all competing for the same resources, but maybe some of them will replicate faster than others. And you'll finish up with just one of them that replicates faster than the others, and you've lost most of the information. They will compete with one another for the resources, the nucleotides out of which they're made. But if you string them together in a chromosome, they have to cooperate. No one of them can get copied without all the others. It is, to use an analogy of Richard Dawkins's, it's like 8 men in a boat. You can only get somewhere if you row with the other guys. I mean, it's no good trying to row in a different direction. So chromosomes, in a sense, forced cooperation on genes which otherwise would have quarreled with one another. The next major transition that we see having happened is the origin of the code, the origin of the situation in which information resident in nucleic acids could be translated into the sequence of amino acids in a protein, which is the basis of all development today. But it wasn't by any means the last major transition that one can see. Perhaps, I'm not going to give a full account, obviously, in 10 minutes I can't. But the next major event, I think, was the origin of sex. You perhaps don't think of sex as a matter of the transformation of information, but you should, among other things anyway. What happens in the sexual process is that information from two different parents is combined in a single descendant. And this enormously increases the amount of different messages, different patterns of information upon which natural selection can act, and therefore enormously accelerates the rate at which evolutionary progress can be made. So one's got the replication of molecules, the origin of chromosomes tying them together, the origin of the code translating information from one form into another, Then you have the origin of sex, enabling different messages from different parents to be combined. There was then a very long wait of a few thousand million years, maybe, before the next major invention, which was the origin of multicellular organisms. Organisms like ourselves, or like my primroses, which have not one cell with one copy of the genetic message, but many hundreds of millions of cells, each with a copy of the genetic message. Now, in a sense, you may say, well, that's not really an increase in information because they've all got the same information. And that's true, but they don't all use all of it. Some of your cells use some of the information. Bone cells use the information they need for making bone. Muscle cells use the information they need for being muscle cells, and so on. And a whole new signaling system, a whole new information transmission system, had to evolve in multicellular organisms in order to ensure that different cells read different bits of their message. And we're at last, after a long delay, I think, at last beginning to understand how that happened. And it perhaps is the most exciting thing, actually, that is today happening in biology. The next major event in the complexification of life, making life more and more complicated, was a situation in which the unit was not a single individual or a pair of individuals and their offspring, but a society of individuals. This, of course, has happened in the social insects, in both the ants, the bees, the wasps, the termites, producing immensely complex societies, but it has also, and most notoriously, happened in ourselves. And to a very large extent, the fact that we have largely transformed the planet upon which we live depends upon that social relationships between us. But it's not by any means obvious what it was, first sight, that made it possible for us to form these very complex societies. But clearly something happened in our ancestors some 50,000 years ago which changed them from a rather rare food gathering, possibly carrion eating, occasionally hunting animal, not an animal upon which one would have regarded as wildly successful, into an animal which is enormously abundant and successful. It caused our ancestors to spread all over the world, to develop a complex material and social culture. It's hard to know for sure what that was, but it seems to me that there's only one thing really it could have been, and that was the origin of yet another information transducing machine, a new way of transmitting information between generations, namely human language. We transmit information from one generation to another, not just by our genes, though we still have that mechanism for transmitting information when needed, but we also transmit information from one generation to another, and from one person to another, of course, by the use of language. And there are, I think, good reasons to think, both on the one hand, that it was that invention of language which was the crucial event that took place in our history, which made us the dominant animal that we are, but also that event depended upon genetic changes in our own nature. In other words, that in order to learn to speak, we had to change genetically. But I want first to draw a rather tight analogy, if I may, between language and the code, the genetic code that I was talking of before, and the replication of nucleic acids. The point that I was trying to make in the first part of this lecture was to persuade you that there really is, that the essential feature of the genetic system is that it can transmit not just a few messages, but an indefinitely large number of messages. There is another coding system which will do that, and that is human language, but peculiarly human language. Animals do have languages. They have words. A vervet monkey has a word for a leopard. It has a different word for an eagle. It has yet a third word for a snake. It has yet another word for another troop of monkeys. And when it uses those words, other monkeys understand what is being said. So it's not that they have no language, but they have a very limited number of things that they can say.